We see that he's providing health care for his people. He's putting people first. He cares about the infrastructure. He's creating systems so that people can thrive instead of being in poverty like we have here in this country.
We know that Ibrahim Traoré is the future of the African continent, that he represents the African wing of the global anti-imperialist movement.
So we are here telling people, hands off Africa. The colonialists need to mind their business.
Why is he a dictator in the mind of the American media? Well, because...
What happens when an African military leader becomes the voice of American protest? That's not a headline, it's real. His name is Ibrahim Traoré, and his image is now lighting up the streets of US cities. Not because of PR, not because of politics, but because of something far more powerful: authenticity. While Western leaders perform on stages, Traoré is busy transforming Burkina Faso from the ground up. He's not chasing applause, he's building systems. Agricultural reform is booming under his watch. And he passed a law: any woman who gives birth, her hospital care is completely free. Because in his country, mothers matter. Now compare that to the silence in Washington. To billion-dollar lobbying while families go bankrupt over hospital bills. No wonder then that in the heart of New York City, a group of protesters chanted his name. Not Biden's, not Trump's, Traoré. Why him? Why now? And why is a West African soldier becoming a global icon for resistance? Because people are desperate for the real thing. It started small, one cardboard sign with his name. But in just 2 days, it exploded into a movement. His name was echoing not just in Burkina Faso, but through the heart of American cities. And it wasn't random. This wasn't a trend. It was a signal of what people are hungry for: real leadership. In a country where citizens feel abandoned by both parties, where trust in institutions is collapsing, Traoré stood out. Not for what he said, but for what he refused to say. He didn't flatter Western media. He didn't chase interviews. He just acted. When Traoré assumed power in 2022, he didn't deliver long-winded speeches. He declared war on foreign dependency. He expelled French troops, rejected IMF conditions, built local infrastructure, and told Western powers, "We don't want charity. We want dignity." These weren't just policy choices, they were symbolic ruptures. He cut the strings colonialism left behind. And Americans, especially Black Americans, noticed. To them, he wasn't just an African leader. He was a revelation. A contradiction to everything they'd been taught: that African nations were unstable, and that real leadership required compromise and foreign approval. Traoré shattered that myth. He proved that a young black man could lead with boldness, discipline, and unwavering clarity, without asking for permission from anyone in the West. That's when things really caught fire. A short clip of Traoré calm in uniform, saying, "We are not here to beg for survival. We are here to reclaim our dignity." Hit TikTok like lightning. American creators, especially black activists, stitched it with clips of US protests, police beatings, poverty, homelessness, and gentrification. The message was undeniable: this man is speaking for us, even from across the ocean. Suddenly, Traoré was more than a headline. He was a symbol. Artists began placing his face in civil rights murals. His image was printed on posters, paired with quotes that cut deep. For many, Traoré represented what the current system in the US lacks: integrity, clarity, and courage. What made him even more compelling? He didn't try to go viral. He didn't appear on CNN. He didn't pander. That silence? It made him more real. In a world addicted to spin, Traoré felt unfiltered. In a political age of curated personas, his rawness became a magnet. Then there was his age. Still in his 30s, he didn't resemble the elite political class Americans are used to. He wasn't born with power, he earned it. And that made him relatable. He sounded like someone who had walked through fire. And for protesters in America, who are tired of being ignored, that mattered more than any resume. Before long, his name wasn't just whispered on social media, it was shouted in the streets. To many in the US, especially in black communities, Traoré wasn't just an inspiration. He was proof that real leadership could come from unexpected places. And with that, Traoré became more than a foreign figure. He became a mirror, reflecting what Americans had lost: leadership rooted in sacrifice, not ambition. So when protesters in New York, Atlanta, Chicago chanted his name, they weren't idolizing a foreign leader. They were demanding something their own system hadn't delivered: truth and strength without compromise. And then came the visual revolution. It began quietly: student-drawn posters, homemade banners. But in days, his name swept across cities like a wave. In Los Angeles, young activists locked arms outside a federal building, holding up signs that read, "While America sleeps, Burkina Faso rises." He said no. So should we. In Atlanta, marchers carried Traoré's portrait, painted by hand. Underneath were 3 unforgettable words: "We remember Sankara." Because to them, Traoré wasn't just new leadership. He was the legacy of African resistance, reborn. It didn't stop there. Soon, artist collectives were stenciling his silhouette across Harlem, Oakland, and Miami. Subway trains and street poles were plastered with his image: his beret, his stare, his defiance. Beneath it, slogans like, "Build like Traoré." The revolution wears a beret. This is what dignity looks like. Then came the slogans aimed not just at celebration, but confrontation. Trump fears what Traoré represents. Online, it was everywhere. TikTok edits spliced Traoré's speeches with US scenes: families evicted, people jailed, protests crushed. The contrast was brutal. The message was bold. One fights for power. The other fights for people. By this point, it wasn't just activists or students paying attention. Celebrities began retweeting his quotes. Commentators took note. But what scared the establishment wasn't the noise, it was the clarity. This wasn't just another political trend. It was a demand. People weren't asking for reform. They were calling for rebirth, for leaders who didn't come from dynasties or corporations, but from the people themselves. And through it all, Traoré never addressed the American attention. No press release. No response. That silence? It made the movement even louder. Because in a world where leaders obsess over image, he refused to perform. And that made his presence more real. His story, his posture, his rebellion, felt less like a foreign tale, and more like a blueprint. So when American youth looked at Traoré, they didn't see a president in Africa. They saw something they had been told didn't exist. A leader who doesn't bow, doesn't break, doesn't sell out. And that's what made his name dangerous in political circles. This wasn't admiration, it was inspiration. This wasn't foreign policy, it was personal. Because when a leader thousands of miles away can speak to your pain better than your own politicians, you stop asking for help. You start demanding change. The protests weren't just fueled by grief, they became commands. Each chant on the street wasn't just rage, it was instruction. What unfolded wasn't just a demonstration. It was a classroom. The slogans painted on signs doubled as history lessons. And at the center of it all stood Traoré, not just as a foreign figure, but as a mirror. One that forced Americans, especially black and immigrant communities, to reflect on the cracks in their own systems. But this movement didn't stop at paint and noise. As the protests swelled, their tremors reached Washington. The same US political machine that had long shrugged off African self-determination now found itself being compared, and not favorably. Inside briefing rooms and security memos, analysts circled a growing anomaly. A young African military leader had become a symbol in American resistance. For a country that only talks about Africa when there's oil, war, or profit on the line, this wasn't just odd, it was humiliating. The narrative that Trump had carefully crafted, one of hard borders, a fortress America, and dominance over troublesome foreign states, was unraveling. And the irony? It was falling apart because of a man Trump had never even planned to mention. Traoré wasn't supposed to be on the radar. But now, he was the radar. And here's the sting: he didn't even have to try. While Trump's administration scrambled to explain the addition of 25 African nations to the expanded visa ban list, protesters flooded Capitol Hill with petitions and congressional phone lines lit up with demands. Why are we punishing countries trying to build themselves up? Why are we blocking Africans from embodying the very values America claims to uphold: sovereignty, discipline, and power? This wasn't just a PR issue. It was a moral gut punch. Trump's policies were now being measured against a real-world leader who embodied the kind of strength people could actually believe in. And the difference? It wasn't subtle. As Trump barked about greatness, the protests flipped the question. If greatness means walls, bans, and suppression, why does Traoré look more like a liberator than our own president? Traoré had stopped being just a name. He had become the measuring stick, a damning point of comparison. Even moderate Democrats found themselves tongue-tied when confronted by a new kind of protest question. Why do we invest billions in military bases across Africa, but ignore African leaders rising without foreign aid? Why does our media highlight African coups more than African breakthroughs? Why do we blacklist nations we've helped destabilize? It was a role reversal no one expected. An African leader becoming the lens through which the West was forced to examine its own failure. While Trump tried to spin the narrative back in his favor, one unshakable truth had already embedded itself into the protest movement. Traoré didn't just kick foreign influence out of Africa, he exposed its rotting core here in America. And this resistance? It didn't stop with slogans. It awakened something deeper. Something louder. A Pan-African consciousness was reawakening, crossing borders, oceans, generations. The movement wasn't just political anymore. It had turned into a reclaiming of identity. By the time Traoré's name echoed from megaphones and splashed across murals, something profound had shifted, not in government chambers, but in the soul of the diaspora. What started as a critique of foreign policy evolved into a cultural eruption. For African Americans and first-generation immigrants, this wasn't about embassies or presidents anymore. This was about legacy. Traoré had become a bridge. For generations, Black Americans were fed a distorted view of Africa, framed as chaotic, impoverished, war-torn. Textbooks taught about famines, not empires. Hollywood showed struggle, not strength. News outlets only covered Africa when blood was spilled. The outcome? A dangerous separation. Even among descendants of the enslaved, Africa became something to pity, not to emulate. But Traoré blew that narrative apart. Here was a young, unapologetically African leader who played by no colonial rulebook. He wasn't seeking IMF bailouts. He wasn't groveling at G7 meetings. He wasn't hiding behind diplomatic smiles taught in Western boarding schools. He wore military green. He radiated fire. He spoke dignity, not dependence. For the diaspora, especially Black Americans raised on the stories of MLK, Malcolm, Angela Davis, and Fred Hampton, Traoré became something they hadn't seen in decades, a global symbol of Black power that didn't ask for approval. That's when the cultural shift got sharper. In Detroit, a youth organization threw out their regular Black History Month syllabus and replaced it with a workshop called From Sankara to Traoré, The Resistance Never Died. Young Black Americans started calling themselves children of Sankara, descendants of Traoré. Not as some poetic metaphor, but as identity. The Pan-African fire, buried under centuries of division, had reignited. Online, the spark spread just as fast. Black artists redesigned African flags with African American themes. Diaspora creators started comparing African governance systems with America's broken institutions. Social media pages that once focused solely on Black Lives Matter began sharing updates from the AES, the Alliance of Sahel States. Hashtags like #ReclaimAfrica and #DiasporaToDignity surged alongside Traoré's name. But the most striking transformation? People stopped seeing Africa as something that needed help, and started seeing it as a source of solutions. Burkina Faso wasn't just one of the world's poorest nations anymore. It was now the country that built 500 electric buses, with zero foreign aid. The nation that kicked out France, and didn't collapse. The land whose president inspired protest slogans in Harlem and Houston. This wasn't some surface-level admiration. It was a full-on reclamation. For years, the diaspora struggled to form real, living connections with Africa, beyond ancestry kits or ceremonial trips. Now with Traoré, they had something concrete. Not just a figure, a direction. Not just history, a mission. That mission? Repairing the fracture between continents. Not through embassies or non-profits, but through shared defiance. And that defiance wasn't abstract anymore. It was actionable. It was political. It was personal. And it led to a new challenge. What next? Now that the chants have echoed and the murals dried, now that identity has reawakened across oceans, where does it all lead? Traoré didn't ask to be turned into a symbol. He didn't request to be turned into a weapon in someone else's battle. But here we are. And that symbolism? It can't be erased. In the minds of many across the diaspora, he's no longer just Burkina Faso's president. He's a global icon of what leadership could be, and should be, in a time of frauds. But here comes the test. What will people do with this symbol? Across US cities, activists are starting to ask real, grounded questions. Can Traoré's model of resistance be translated locally? Can cities like Baltimore or Oakland embrace community production and reject corporate capture? Can black schools teach not just slavery and civil rights, but modern African governance? Some aren't waiting to find out. In Chicago, a grassroots co-op is developing urban agriculture plans based on Burkina Faso's food independence playbook. In Brooklyn, a Pan-African film festival is dropping trauma porn in favor of films on African leadership. In Atlanta, a study series is being launched, not just to celebrate Traoré, but to dissect the economics behind his vision. This shift is massive. For the first time in decades, Black America isn't just mourning injustice, it's borrowing blueprints from victory. The relationship with Africa is no longer paternal or abstract. It's strategic. It's intentional. Even politically, it's gaining momentum. Candidates for city councils and mayoral offices are now referencing Africa, not as a charity case, but as an example. One progressive candidate in Minneapolis made headlines for saying, "We don't need Wall Street. We need what Traoré has: food security, energy independence, and land control." That statement shook the status quo. For decades, Africa was seen by the West as a place of charity, not strategy. Now policymakers are scrambling to explain how one African soldier became the guiding light for Western uprisings. Think tanks have already issued warnings about ideological contagion, a phrase once reserved for Cuba or Venezuela. And they're right to panic. Because this is no longer about a protest. This is a philosophical revolt, one that asks a question America's elite cannot answer. If a poor, sanctioned African country can stand up for its people without compromise, why can't the richest country in the world? Traoré's rise exposes the myth buried inside Western liberalism, that change must be slow, polite, and always deferential to power. He didn't wait. He didn't beg. He acted. And in doing so, he lit a fire under a generation done with being patient. But there's a danger. Symbols fade fast when they're not built into systems. If this movement around Traoré becomes just another TikTok trend or quote on a shirt, it will collapse like the rest. That's why educators, leaders, and organizers are now focused on memory. Not just what Traoré did, but how he did it. Not just praising him, but replicating his model. Because the future of this global movement boils down to one question. Can admiration turn into application? If the answer is yes, then we're not just watching a moment. We're witnessing the beginning of something far greater, a redefinition of global leadership. One where it's not geography or GDP that sets the standard, but courage, clarity, and community. One where Burkina Faso no longer follows the world. The world follows Burkina Faso. What started as anger at Trump revealed something much deeper, a hunger for authenticity, dignity, and leaders who don't sell out. And maybe, just maybe, that hunger will reshape not just America, but the power balance of the entire world.